Los Angeles, California, August 1972. The temperature on the lot at Warner Brothers studio had climbed to 107 degrees by 2 in the afternoon, and the air above the asphalt moved in slow, visible waves. Stage 12 had been reserved since dawn for a production that would not be named on the call sheet. There were 41 people inside that building when the doors were pulled shut. Most of them were crew. A few were fighters. One of them was the most dangerous human being alive, and he had arrived without an announcement, in a plain white undershirt and canvas shoes, carrying nothing. The man who had called this meeting was 21 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, and 133 pounds. He held the record in the 1958 Hong Kong Cha-Cha Championships. He had studied Wing Chun under Ip Man for 4 years. He had trained with wrestlers, boxers, fencers, and grapplers across 3 continents. He could throw a punch in 0.05 of a second. Independent timing studies had verified the number. He had beaten men twice his size in venues that did not appear in any official record, in cities that would not confirm the events took place. He was not widely known yet outside of a narrow circle of martial arts professionals and Hong Kong cinema. But inside that circle, the name Bruce Lee carried a weight that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not felt it. He had a specific grievance that morning. He had spoken it to 3 people before he arrived on stage 12, and each of the 3 had tried to redirect him. None of them had succeeded. The grievance was this. There was a man in Los Angeles who had been telling students, in dojos and in gyms and in conversations after training, that the techniques Bruce Lee was popularizing through his films and his demonstrations were, in the precise language that had been repeated back to him, theatrical, decorative, built for cameras, not for contact. The man who had said those things was 32 years old. He stood 6 feet tall and weighed 188 pounds. He held a 6th-degree black belt in Tang Soo Do. He was the Professional Karate Association middleweight champion of 1968, 1969, 1970, and 1971. He had not lost a sanctioned professional fight in 6 years. He had retired from competition the previous spring, undefeated, with a record of 183 wins and 10 draws. His name was Chuck Norris. What was about to happen in the next 47 seconds would be witnessed by 41 people, remembered by all of them for the rest of their lives, and spoken about in the martial arts community of Los Angeles for the next 5 decades. Nobody in that building, including the 2 men at the center of it, knew they were standing inside what would become the most referenced private encounter in the history of American martial arts. The sentence Chuck Norris would speak from the floor before he stood back up would be repeated in dojos from Los Angeles to Seoul for the rest of the century. Stay until the very end of this story, because the meaning of what he said only becomes clear in the final act. Bruce Lee had been on the Warner Brothers lot for 11 days by then, working with the production team on a project that would become one of the most successful martial arts films in the history of the medium. He was not on the lot as a visitor. He was there as a creative force, as a technical consultant, as a performer, and as a man with precise opinions about how the human body moved and what it was capable of under real pressure. He spent his mornings training alone. He spent his afternoons in meetings. He spent his evenings studying film. The information about what Chuck Norris had said had reached him through a man named Bob Wall, a karate competitor and actor who moved between both worlds and who understood the weight of what he was carrying when he passed the message along. Wall had not editorialized. He had repeated the words as they had been said: theatrical, decorative, built for cameras. Bruce Lee had listened without expression. He had asked one question. He had said, "Does he believe it?" Wall had said, "Yes." Bruce Lee had said, "Then we should settle it." The meeting had been arranged through a single phone call. Chuck Norris had agreed without hesitation. This was not, in his understanding, a challenge. It was a conversation between professionals who had things to learn from each other. He had trained with Joe Louis and Mike Stone and the best American fighters of the decade. He had watched Bruce Lee's early films. He respected the athleticism and the speed. He had reservations about the application of the techniques in a real encounter against a trained opponent. He arrived on stage 12 that morning with his reservations intact and his mind open. He walked in through the side door. There were folding chairs arranged along one wall, and most of the crew was sitting in them. The production lights were off. The space was lit by the ambient light coming through the high windows and by two portable work lights positioned near the center of the floor. The floor was unfinished concrete, covered in places by rubber matting. There was a sound like the building settling in the heat. Chuck Norris scanned the room. He identified the camera operator who had set down his equipment near the far wall. He identified the script supervisor standing with both hands in her pockets. He identified Bob Wall near the door. He did not immediately identify Bruce Lee. Then he did. Bruce Lee was sitting on an equipment crate near the center of the space. He was not stretching. He was not warming up. He was not doing anything at all. He was sitting with one foot on the floor and one knee drawn up, and he was watching Chuck Norris cross the room with an expression of calm and complete attention. He did not stand up yet. Chuck Norris stopped approximately 12 feet away. He said, "I was told you wanted to talk." Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I do not want to talk." The room went quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone present understands simultaneously that the event has already begun. If you want to see what happened in those 47 seconds, make sure you are subscribed to this channel right now and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. This story belongs to all of you. Chuck Norris had not fought on a concrete floor since his early training years. His competition record had been built on matted tournament surfaces with referees and weight classes and controlled conditions. He understood the theoretical difference between a controlled environment and an uncontrolled one. He had not, in his professional career, encountered a situation where the difference between the two was about to be demonstrated to him at speed. He removed his jacket. He folded it once at the center seam and set it on the equipment crate to his left. He stood with his weight balanced and his hands at his sides. Bruce Lee stepped down from the crate. He was wearing canvas shoes and a white undershirt and plain trousers. And he looked, to the people watching from the chairs against the wall, like a man who had come to help move furniture. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall in those shoes. He weighed 133 pounds. He looked at Chuck Norris with the particular attention of a man who has already completed most of his thinking and is now simply waiting for confirmation. The camera operator, whose name was Gerald Marsh, said afterward that the temperature in the room seemed to drop when Bruce Lee stepped off the crate. He said he could not explain that. He said it was the only way he could describe it. The sound supervisor, a man named Pete Clifford with 14 years in the industry, set down his coffee cup on the chair beside him with deliberate care. He did not pick it up again for the rest of the afternoon. Bob Wall took one step backward and put his shoulder against the wall. He has already lost, one of the observers would write in a letter sent to a colleague in Hong Kong 18 months later. He just does not know it yet. Chuck Norris moved first. He closed the 12 feet between them in a controlled approach and opened with a front kick targeting the midsection. It was a legitimate technique. It had worked against professional fighters in tournament conditions. It was precise, fast, and generated from the hip with the full mechanics of 6 years of competition training behind it. It did not land. To understand what happened to that kick, It is necessary to understand something about distance. A fight is not two men hitting each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance, and the man who controls the distance between two bodies controls everything that follows. The gap between 4 feet and 3 feet is not 1 foot. It is the difference between a technique that has room to develop and a technique that is already over before it begins. Bruce Lee did not block the kick. He did not parry it. He redirected his own position by approximately 8 inches to the outside, and the kick passed through air that he had just vacated. The movement was so small that 3 of the observers seated along the wall were not certain they had seen it happen. Second 2. Chuck Norris read the redirect and adjusted. He followed with a rear hand straight targeting the jaw. This was his fastest technique. Bob Wall had seen it land on fighters who were prepared for it. It covered the distance in a measured 11/100ths of a second. Bruce Lee's head was not there when it arrived. It was not a duck, and it was not a slip in the conventional sense. It was an absence. Chuck Norris's fist passed through a space where a jawline had been and found nothing, and the momentum of the punch carried him 4 inches further forward than he had intended to travel. Those 4 inches were the margin. Gerald Marsh, the camera operator, said later that he saw Chuck Norris's right shoulder dip forward and thought for one moment that he had slipped on the concrete. He understood in the following second that he had not slipped. Second 4. Chuck Norris planted his rear foot and loaded the left hook. This was the technique he trusted most. It had ended fights. It had ended fights against men who saw it coming. He threw it with full commitment and full rotation, and the sound of it moving through the air was audible to the people sitting against the wall. It connected with nothing. Bruce Lee had stepped inside it. Not away from it. Inside it. He had moved into the space between Chuck Norris's guard and his body and closed the distance to approximately 8 inches. And at 8 inches, the hook had no room to develop, and no power, and no meaning. What happened in the following 3 seconds is the part of this story that the witnesses described differently for the rest of their lives. The details varied. The outcome did not. Bruce Lee's right hand came up. It did not travel far. It did not need to. A strike thrown from 8 inches that lands flush does not require distance to cause a man to reassess the structural integrity of his understanding of the world. Chuck Norris absorbed the strike, and his balance shifted, and his left knee touched the concrete floor, and he was down on one knee in the center of Stage 12 with the work lights above him and 41 people watching in. A silence so complete that Pete Clifford said afterward he could hear the sound of the building settling in the heat. He stayed there for a moment. 1 full breath. Maybe 2. Then Bruce Lee did something that none of the observers had anticipated, and most of them would spend years trying to explain. He extended his right hand. Not a gesture, not a demonstration. A hand extended to a man on his knee on a concrete floor, offered without theater and without commentary. Chuck Norris looked at the hand. He looked at it for a moment that Gerald Marsh later estimated at approximately 4 seconds. Then he reached up and took it. Bruce Lee pulled him to his feet with the same economy of motion he applied to everything else. When Chuck Norris was standing again, Bruce Lee leaned in close and spoke 4 words. He spoke them quietly enough that the nearest observer, Bob Wall, standing 7 feet away with his shoulder against the wall, could not make them out completely. Wall would spend 12 years trying to confirm the exact phrasing. He eventually concluded he had heard 3 of the 4 words correctly. What he was certain of was this. The 4 words were not an insult. They were not a verdict. They were something closer to an invitation. Chuck Norris stood at a fork in the road. Every man who goes down in front of witnesses stands at that same fork eventually. On one side of it is the explanation, the floor, the lights, the conditions, the fact that this was not a sanctioned environment, the fact that any number of variables had been operating outside the normal parameters of a professional exchange. On the other side of it is something harder and more useful. He chose the harder thing. He said, "I need to see that again." He did not say it loudly. He said it in the same register a man uses when he is speaking to himself and happens to be overheard. But in the silence of Stage 12, in the heat of an August afternoon in Los Angeles, everyone present heard it clearly. The production assistant near the door wrote it down. The sound supervisor, Pete Clifford, told the story of those 5 words at a gathering of audio professionals in San Francisco in 1989, 17 years later, and the room went quiet when he said them. Bob Wall repeated them in a published interview in 1994. What Chuck Norris said next, directly to Bruce Lee, before they spent the following 2 hours and 40 minutes on that concrete floor together, was simpler still. He said, "Show me." There was a man named Raymond Chow who produced martial arts films in Hong Kong and who had been associated with the Warner Brothers project in a consultative capacity. He was not present on Stage 12 that afternoon, but he received a written account of the session within 72 hours. He read it twice and then called a colleague in Los Angeles and said, "I need you to explain to me what is meant by the phrase 'he redirected his position.'" The colleague explained it as best he could. Raymond Chow said nothing for a moment. Then, he said, and Norris understood this in real time. The colleague said he understood it by the time he was on one knee. Raymond Chow was quiet for another moment. Then, he said, that is the faster education. The 41 people who were in Stage 12 that afternoon dispersed across the industry over the following decades. They worked in production and sound and lighting and camera, and they carried the story with them into every room they entered for the rest of their professional lives. The story grew in some of its dimensions. The 47 seconds became a minute in some versions, became 90 seconds in others. The crowd grew from 41 to 60 in certain tellings, and to 80 in at least one account published in a martial arts magazine in 1981. The location migrated in 2 separate retellings, once to a gym in Culver City, and once, inexplicably, to a parking structure. What never changed across any version of the story, in any telling by any of the 41 witnesses, was this, what Chuck Norris said when he stood back up from that concrete floor. In 1978, 6 years after the afternoon on Stage 12, Chuck Norris opened a chain of martial arts schools across the United States. The curriculum he developed for those schools contained, embedded inside the section on defensive principles, a concept about distance management that his instructors were required to teach in the 3rd lesson of the intermediate course. It did not carry Bruce Lee's name. It did not need to. The people who had been in the room knew where it came from. Bruce Lee died in July of 1973, 11 months after the afternoon on Stage 12. He was 32 years old. The cause of death was determined to be cerebral edema. He was working on the production of Enter the Dragon when he died. The film was released 6 days after his death and became one of the most successful martial arts films in the history of cinema. Chuck Norris was a pallbearer at his funeral. He stood at the grave in Seattle on a July morning that was cooler than it had any right to be for the time of year. And he did not speak to the press, and he did not speak to the cameras. And he stood with his hands at his sides, and his face composed in an expression that the photographers present could not quite categorize, and he was not there long. He left before most of the other attendees. James Coburn, who had also been a student of Bruce Lee and who stood at the same graveside that morning, said in an interview published 2 years later that he had watched Chuck Norris at the funeral and had been struck by how still he was. He said, "Most people move when they are in grief. They shift their weight. they look at things. Norris just stood there, like he was waiting for something. In 1993, 20 years after Bruce Lee's death, Chuck Norris was asked in a television interview to name the most important technical encounter of his martial arts career. He had competed in hundreds of sanctioned matches. He had trained with the best fighters of 2 generations. He paused for a moment before answering. He said, "There was an afternoon on a film lot in 1972. The interviewer asked him to say more. He said, "I learned something about distance that afternoon that I had been missing for 6 years. The interviewer asked him what specifically he had learned. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the space you think you are controlling is the space your opponent has already left." He did not elaborate. He moved on to the next question. The 4 words Bruce Lee spoke to him on that concrete floor, the 4 words that Bob Wall spent 12 years attempting to confirm and never quite could, were repeated once more in a published context in 2004, in a book written by a martial artist who had trained under a student of one of the original 41 witnesses. The author acknowledged the uncertainty of the attribution. He included the phrase anyway, because, as he wrote in a brief editorial note, whether or not those were the exact words, they were the correct words for what had happened in that room. The phrase was, "You were looking ahead." 4 words spoken to a man on one knee on a concrete floor, by a man who had just demonstrated the difference between looking at where something is and understanding where it is going. What the afternoon on Stage 12 in August of 1972 produced was not a victory and not a defeat in any useful sense of either word. What it produced was a correction. In the martial arts tradition, the correction offered by a superior practitioner to a student who has earned the right to receive it is considered a form of respect that exceeds many other forms. Chuck Norris had not gone to that building as a student. He left it as one. And the distance between those 2 positions, traveled in 47 seconds on a concrete floor in a building that was 107 degrees and is no longer standing, is the precise distance that separates a man who knows what he can do from a man who is beginning to understand what he could not. The technique Chuck Norris did not see coming that afternoon was not the hand that brought him to one knee. The technique was the invitation that came after it. The extended hand. The 4 quiet words. The 2 hours and 40 minutes of instruction that followed them. A man who defeats you and walks away has given you nothing. A man who defeats you and then teaches you has given you the rest of your career. Chuck Norris built one of the most successful martial arts franchises in American history. He trained thousands of students over 5 decades. He appeared in more than 60 films. He is, at the age of 84, still teaching. Every student who has ever walked through the door of a Chun Kuk Do school and been taught the principles of distance management in the 3rd lesson of the intermediate course received something that was shaped, in part, by 47 seconds on a concrete floor in Los Angeles in the summer of 1972. They did not know that. Most of them still do not. Now, you do. Next week, this channel tells the story of the afternoon in a Burbank gymnasium in 1979, when a decorated United States Army Ranger, fresh from 2 tours and carrying a record that the Army would not confirm and 2 gyms in Los Angeles had already heard about, walked into one of Chuck Norris's schools and told the instructor at the front desk that he had come to test the curriculum. The instructor called the back office. The man who walked out of the back office was not who the Ranger expected. What happened in the following 11 minutes produced one of the most requested stories in the history of this channel. Do not miss it.